I am the most notorious kingpin in the southern part of the city. Every single one of my 300 brothers under me is a fierce, tattooed tough guy. The day the police launched a sudden raid to crack down on vice, they surrounded my nightclub so tightly that not even a drop of water could leak out. The beautiful officer leading the squad kicked the private room door wide open. Everyone, hands on your heads, squat down, and hand over the contraband. The private room fell dead silent. 300 shirtless, burly men tremblingly raised their hands. What they were clutching were neither machetes nor white powder, but copies of 5 years of college entrance exams, 3 years of mock tests. I extinguished my cigarette, slowly stood up, and pointed at the trigonometric functions on the chalkboard. Officer, is it a crime for us to study? The beautiful officer, Lin Feijoa, looked at the wall entirely covered with the slogan "Knowledge changes destiny," her almond eyes widening in profound disbelief as if she had just stepped into an alternate dimension where gangsters traded bullets for books. Her face was full of astonishment. There was no music in the entire private room, no alcohol, and no women. There was only a strong scent of sweat mixed with the smell of ink. 300 robust, shirtless men, their tattoos reflecting under the bright lights. They squatted on the ground, hands clasped behind their heads. Spread open in front of every single person was a copy of 5 years of college entrance exams, 3 years of mock tests. My name is Zhu Rambutan. I am their boss. Lin Feijoa's gaze shifted from the "Don't bully the youth for being poor" slogan on the wall, straight onto my face. Zhu Rambutan, what the hell are you playing at? Her voice was chillingly cold. I casually pointed at the chalkboard right in front of me, tapping the dusty surface with my index finger to emphasize the dense equations written there, maintaining an unbothered, stoic expression. The board was densely packed with trigonometric functions. We are attending cram school, officer. Which law states that evening tutoring is forbidden? Lin Feijoa remained silent. A young cop beside her could not hold back, tapping his baton against the desk. Stop playing dumb. Where are your illegal goods? Where did you hide the drugs and guns? Lin Feijoa steadied her breathing. She waved her hand, and whoosh, a swarm of police officers rushed in. They began tearing the place apart, searching through every chest and cabinet. My brothers remained remarkably quiet. They continued squatting on the floor with their heads in their hands, yet their eyes were all glued to the practice workbooks in front of them. A brother named Pao Yuzu quietly asked, "Brother Long, can I squeeze in 2 more multiple-choice questions?" He whispered pleadingly, clutching his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting between the test paper and the intimidating police officers. "I'm running out of time." I nodded. "Do it. Pay attention to keeping your test paper neat." Lin Feijoa overheard our conversation. Her facial muscles twitched. Half an hour later, the search team captain found nothing. Except. He paused, his expression incredibly bizarre. Except for over 500 copies of 5 years of exams, 3 years of mocks, 80 boxes of A4 scratch paper, and literal tons of various supplementary tutoring books. Lin Feijoa's expression froze stiff. She walked right up to me, staring intently into my eyes. "Zhu Rambutan, what exactly are you trying to do?" I looked at her and answered earnestly. "I want to lead my brothers to pass the college entrance exam," I stated with unwavering conviction, my voice steady and resonant enough to echo off the walls, making sure every single person in that room understood the gravity of my ambition. "And then find proper jobs to pay our social security." Lin Feijoa fell silent. She looked at the 300 muscular men in the private room, then glanced back at the "Knowledge changes destiny" banner on the wall. Finally, she holstered her gun. "Everyone, pack it up." The police rapidly withdrew. Upon reaching the doorway, Lin Feijoa threw one last glance back at me. "Zhu Rambutan, I will be keeping my eyes on you." I waited until the nightclub's heavy door slammed shut again. Then, I addressed my brothers. "All right, the cops are gone. Class, stand up." 300 burly men stood up in perfect unison to resume their lesson. "Yes, Brother Long." Their voices shook the heavens. I picked up a piece of white chalk, tossing it lightly in the air and catching it with a practiced flair before turning back to the worn-out blackboard, ready to resume my role as their unlikely mentor. Top left corner. Where did we leave off? Oh, the law of cosines. Take out your pens and take notes. The private room was left with only the rustling sound of pens scratching on paper. Lin Feijoa had not left the premises entirely. She sat in the master control room, monitoring the surveillance screens. On the monitor, I was writing furiously on the blackboard. "Captain Lin, this gang must be hatching a conspiracy. Who ever heard of a triad collectively taking the college entrance exams?" Lin Feijoa did not answer him. She simply kept watching me on the screen. On the display, I wiped the sweat from my forehead. This is a 3-point question. Why do some of you still get it wrong? Pao Yuzu, you, come up here. The brother named Pao Yuzu, who had a prominent scar across his face, swallowed hard, his tough guy exterior entirely crumbling as he faced the sheer terror of public math problem solving. He walked up to the podium with a miserable expression. Picking up the chalk, his hand trembled violently like a sifter. Inside the surveillance room, Lin Feizhou's brows furrowed even deeper. She picked up the walkie-talkie. I'm staying here tonight. Lin Feizhou actually booked a room in the hotel directly across from the nightclub. She began using binoculars to keep us under strict surveillance. Imagine staking out a mob boss only to catch him enthusiastically teaching the Pythagorean theorem. Peak cinematic irony right there. The next morning at 6 a.m. sharp, the nightclub doors opened right on time. My 300 brothers, wearing matching tracksuits, came out for their morning jog. As they ran, they were murmuring incessantly to themselves. Lin Feizhou could see it clearly through her high-powered binoculars. Leading the pack, Hu Augustine held a small booklet tightly in his hand, his heavily tattooed biceps flexing rhythmically with each stride as he squinted at the tiny print in the morning light. It read, 3,500 Essential English Words for High School. The motto they were chanting was, as heaven maintains vigor through movement, a gentleman should constantly strive for self-perfection. As Earth's condition is receptive devotion, the gentleman should hold the outer world with broad-mindedness. Inside the hotel room, the young cop's jaw was practically hitting the floor. Captain, they even do morning exercises. Lin Feizhou set down the binoculars, rubbing her eyes. She felt as though her entire worldview had just suffered a catastrophic blow. She watched us for the entire day. Our morning sessions consisted of math and physics. The afternoon was reserved for Chinese and English. Evenings were dedicated to chemistry and biology, plus a comprehensive set of science mock exams. Our daily routine and schedule operated with military precision, leaving no room for slacking off, transforming these hardened street brawlers into highly disciplined academic machines. It was far stricter than any top-tier high school. During meal times, the cafeteria broadcasted English listening comprehension tests. Even in the restrooms, on the door of every single stall, a periodic table of elements was firmly plastered. Lights out for bedtime was at exactly 10 p.m. Not a single loud noise could be heard throughout the entire nightclub. There was only the sound of flipping pages and pen tips gliding across paper. By the third day, Lin Feizhou finally could not hold back anymore. She returned. This time, she did not bring a squad, just that one young police officer. When she walked into the private room, we were right in the middle of our weekly mock exam. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. I sat at the teacher's desk acting as the proctor, my gaze sweeping sharply across the room like a hawk, ensuring no one dared to peek at their neighbor's paper or sneak a cheat sheet. Seeing her enter, I made a shush gesture. Lin Feizhou stood by the door, watching these 300 tattooed brutes writing at breakneck speed. Owen brother wanted to scratch an itch, but just as his hand lifted, I shot a lethal glare his way. He immediately put his hand right back down. Exam room discipline was brutally strict. When the exam concluded, I collected the papers. 10-minute break. The brothers let out long, collective exhales. Some were massaging their stiff, aching necks, while others slumped over their desks, refusing to move an inch. Lin Feizhou walked up to me. Zhu Rambutan, I need to have a talk with you, she demanded, crossing her arms defensively while trying to mask the overwhelming curiosity burning in her eyes. I nodded. Let us go to my office. My office was the former general manager's suite of the nightclub. Now, what hung on the walls were no longer expensive paintings, but a massive world map and a timeline of Chinese history. What is your real objective? I already told you, taking the college entrance exam. I do not buy it. 300 street thugs who have been messing around for over a decade, suddenly dropping their blades to pick up pens. Zhu Rambutan, do you honestly think I'd believe that? I poured her a cup of tea. Whether you believe it or not is your business. I only do what I believe is right. Lin Feizhou glared at me. These men under your command, the criminal records of your men combined could be printed into an entire encyclopedia, she scoffed, gesturing vaguely towards the door where my burly students were still diligently taking notes. Do you think they even possess the qualifications to participate in the exam? Qualifications aren't decided by you, nor are they decided by me. I slid a copy of the education law across the desk toward her. The law decides. It stays right here. Any citizen holding nationality, regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, race, or educational background restrictions, can participate in the National College Entrance Examination. Lin Feijuo was left momentarily speechless by my retort. She picked up that dog-eared law book, noticing it was heavily annotated with highlighted key points. She remained quiet for a long while. Where did you get the money to sustain such massive expenses? Is the money I saved up from the past enough for you? I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my tea, projecting an aura of quiet confidence. If we budget carefully, it should carry us right up to exam day. Lin Feijuo probed further. And the teachers you hired? I teach them myself. She wore a look of pure skepticism. I pulled a yellowed piece of paper out from my drawer. It was my college entrance exam transcript, from many years ago. Lin Feijuo took it, and the moment she saw the score written on it, her pupils noticeably contracted. Total scores in 18. Provincial Science Valedictorian. She snapped her head up, her face written with profound shock. Why did not you go to university back then? I took the transcript back. I neatly placed it right back into the drawer, sliding it shut with a soft click, locking away a past that felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. My family was poor, and my father got his legs broken by thugs. We needed cash for his medical treatments. I went to demand the medical fees, and accidentally beat the guy into critical condition. I spoke with eerie calmness, as if recounting someone else's tragic tale. Lin Feijuo's gaze grew deeply complicated. She did not press the matter any further. The office fell into a heavy silence. Even if you can pass it, what about those brothers of yours? They haven't even graduated from middle school. The shade is real, but to be fair, jumping from middle school dropout to quantum physics is a massive leap of faith. You do not need to worry about that. I believe in them. Right at that precise moment, the office door was suddenly knocked on, the frantic pounding shattering the fragile silence that had just settled between the officer and me. Hu Mangistine popped his head in. Brother-in-law, bad news. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano brought his crew to smash the place up. Lin Feijuo's expression shifted instantly. She sprang to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the firearm at her waist. I gently held her hand down. Officer, this is my turf. I will handle it. I stood up, straightened my collar a bit, and offered Lin Feijuo a faint smile. Perfect timing for you to witness our study results. I stepped out of the office. Out in the nightclub's main lobby, stood dozens of punks armed with steel pipes. Leading them was Mad Dog Wang Kiwano from the west side of the city, a notoriously ruthless thug who wore a garish gold chain and a perpetually arrogant smirk on his scarred face. My old rival, Mad Dog Wang Kiwano, spotted me. He grinned menacingly. Rambutan, I heard you switched careers to become a teacher. Why aren't you collecting protection fees anymore? Got the guts to collect tuition fees now? The lackeys behind him erupted into boisterous laughter. My brothers stood directly opposite him. They held no weapons in their hands. What they were holding were the mock exam papers that had just been handed out. Every single face was etched with furious indignation. I stepped in front of my crew. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano. Long time no see. What brings you to my place? Mad Dog Wang Kiwano pointed his steel pipe at me. Nothing much. Just heard the feng shui here is pretty fantastic. So I figured I'd borrow it for a bit. He sneered, dragging the metal pipe against the floor tiles to create a menacing, ear-piercing scraping sound. My boys are a little tight on cash lately, so we want to open a few joints here to make some pocket change. This was a blatantly naked provocation. In the past, I would have ordered Hu Mangistine and the boys to strike long ago. But today, I chose a different path. I looked squarely at him. You can open your joints, but you have to follow my rules. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano froze for a second. Your rules? What kind of rules? I turned around and said to Pao Yuzu, fetch our admission guidelines and let him take a look. Pao Yuzu dashed into the private room, grabbed a piece of A4 paper, and handed it over to the rival boss. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano took it and skimmed it. The fat on his face quivered in rage. Rambutan, are you playing me? Joining your crew requires. He stammered, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple as his small brain struggled to process the sheer absurdity of the document. Rule 1. Recite and write from memory the entire text of an exhortation to learning. Rule 2. Proficiently master 5 methods of solving quadratic equations in one variable. Rule 3. Possess an English vocabulary of no less than 2,000 words. What kind of bullshit rules are these? He crumpled the paper into a ball and hurled it onto the floor. I bent down, picked it up, and smoothed it out. These are the rules of a new era. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano. We are currently in the knowledge economy era. Senseless fighting and killing offer no future. If you genuinely want to partner up, you are welcome. I will personally tutor you in mathematics. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano trembled violently with pure rage. Tutor my ass. He raised the heavy steel pipe and swung it viciously toward my head. Lin Fei Zhou screamed from the office doorway. Stop! But it was already too late. The heavy steel weapon descended with lethal momentum, aiming straight for my skull as the room gasped in collective horror. The pipe reached the crown of my head accompanied by the whistling of wind. I did not flinch. A single hand reached out from beside me, catching the steel pipe with unshakable stability. It was Humangistine. His other hand was still holding the exam paper, and his eyes had not even left the text. He merely stated calmly to the furious boss, Mister, please do not interrupt our studies. Brother Long said, before the exams, anyone who delays our revision is our mortal enemy. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano was stunned. He tried frantically to yank the steel pipe back, but Humangistine's grip was like an iron vise. His face flushed beet red, utilizing every last ounce of strength he had, but the steel pipe would not budge a single millimeter, locked firmly in place as if it had been welded to a titanium vise. Humangistine was still reviewing his paper, muttering continuously, F equals m times a. Force is the underlying reason for altering an object's state of motion. He suddenly lifted his head, locking eyes with Mad Dog Wang Kiwano. If you wish to smash the steel pipe onto Brother Long's head, you need to provide me with acceleration. According to Newton's second law, the force you apply minus the resistance from my hand results in the net force that can generate acceleration. As it stands right now, your force is sorely lacking. After Humangistine finished his impromptu lecture, he delivered a swift, subtle flick of his wrist. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano let out a pathetic yelp, the steel pipe flying out of his grasp, causing his entire body to stagger backward several steps, his face pale with shock as he clutched his throbbing wrist in agonizing disbelief. The pack of thugs he brought along stared in utterly dumbfounded awe. What on earth was going on here? Delivering a physics lecture before throwing hands. I patted Humangistine's shoulder. Applying what you learn. Not bad. However, dealing with this sort of person does not require such complexity. I stepped forward, retrieved the discarded steel pipe from the ground, and weighed it in my hands. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano, do you understand the principle of leverage? Mad Dog Wang Kiwano cradled his injured wrist, watching me with intense vigilance. What the hell is that? Archimedes once said, give me a fulcrum, and I shall move the entire world. I pressed one end of the steel pipe firmly against the floor, while I stepped firmly on the other end with my foot, anchoring it securely to the ground to establish the perfect mechanical advantage. Then I used just 2 fingers to lightly pinch the middle of the pipe. With a slight application of force, snap, the solid metal pipe folded directly in the center, forming a flawlessly precise 90-degree angle. The entire venue descended into dead silence. Physics teachers around the globe are weeping tears of pure joy at this flawless, intimidation-based practical demonstration. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano and his subordinate goons looked as if their eyeballs were about to pop out of their sockets. I tossed the ruined pipe right at his feet. The point of applied force, the fulcrum, and the length of the lever arm dictate the final outcome. Relying on brute force is the most primitive display. Only by wielding knowledge can one move 1,000 pounds with 4 ounces. I stared at him icily. Now, do you still want to open your gambling joints on my turf? I asked softly, letting the ruined pipe drop from my hand with a dull, heavy clatter to punctuate my question. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano's complexion flashed between pale white and sickly green. He looked at me, and then at the 300 massive men behind me clutching their exam papers. The looks in those brawny men's eyes were exactly like students glaring at an annoying pest who dared to interrupt their self-study period. He completely chickened out. Rambutan, you just wait. He dropped a hollow threat and tucked his tail between his legs, scurrying away with his men in utter defeat. Crisis averted. My brothers instantly swarmed around me. Brother Long, you're awesome. Brother Long, could you explain that leverage principle again? I did not quite catch it. And what about Newton's second law? Another burly guy chimed in, scratching his bald head in genuine academic frustration. Brother Who, recite it one more time for us. The scene spontaneously morphed into a high-level academic symposium. The noise was giving me a massive headache. All of you, get back to doing your test papers. For today's comprehensive science test, anyone scoring under 100 points gets no dinner tonight. The crowd scattered instantly. The main hall returned to its serene quiet. At that moment, Lin Fei Zhou emerged from the office. The way she looked at me was exceedingly complex. It was a mix of shock and curiosity, along with a subtle trace of something I could not quite decipher. Rambutan, You truly are different from before. I chuckled lightly. People always need to progress. Is there anything else, officer? If there's nothing else, I need to go grade these exam papers, I stated matter-of-factly, gently tapping the thick stack of tests to align their edges. Lin Feijoa shook her head gently. I merely wanted to verify if you were genuinely intending to walk the straight and narrow path. Now, I have seen it. After saying that, she turned to leave. As she reached the door, she paused again. By the way, that leverage principle you utilized just now, if the length of the lever arm is doubled, does it mean you only need half the amount of force? I was taken aback for a second, then nodded. Theoretically, yes, that is correct. Lin Feijoa let out a soft "oh." Understood. Sorry for the intrusion. She departed. Staring at her receding silhouette, I suddenly found the situation somewhat amusing. It felt like I had not just given my brothers a lesson, but I had also unexpectedly managed to deliver a profound, impromptu physics lecture to a bewildered law enforcement officer. Furthermore, I taught a cop a live physics class. The ensuing days were peaceful and calm. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano never returned to cause trouble. Lin Feijoa did not make another appearance either. Yet we all knew deep down that she was still observing us from somewhere hidden. This bestowed upon the brothers an invisible layer of pressure, but it also fueled them with intense motivation. They studied even more rigorously, because they desperately wanted to prove to that female cop that this was not just some elaborate theatrical show. Time flew by in the blink of an eye. Soon, there were only 100 days left until the college entrance exam. A bright red countdown board was proudly hung inside the nightclub. The ambience grew increasingly high stakes. Everyone's nerves were stretched incredibly taut, the collective anxiety palpable in the air, thick enough to be cut with a knife as sleep became a luxury of the past. In order to alleviate the immense pressure on everyone, I organized a grand oath-taking rally. It took place right in the sprawling lobby of the nightclub. 300 brothers wore identical shirts, with 4 massive words printed across their chests: knowledge changes destiny. They stood tall under the crimson flag, raising their right fists to pledge alongside me. 100 days. We shall forge a miracle. 100 days. We will alter our destinies. Tsinghua and Peking University, here we come. Their battle cries were deafeningly loud. After shouting the oath, everyone's blood was boiling with passion. It felt as if those prestigious university acceptance letters were already well within our grasp. But right at that very moment, the heavy double doors of the nightclub were violently pushed open, letting in a chilling gust of evening wind that snuffed out our celebratory mood. An uninvited guest shattered our enthusiasm. A man dressed sharply in a tailored suit strutted in, flanked by a massive entourage of bodyguards. His name was Xiao Cherimoya, the true mastermind reigning over this entire district. Mad Dog Wang Kiwano was merely a lapdog he kept on a leash. I also used to be one of the men working under his command. Later on, I branched out on my own and we parted ways. He froze for a moment upon witnessing our spectacular setup. Then he burst into laughter. Rambutan. What on earth are you doing? Cosplaying as a top-tier high school. I met his gaze. Fourth Master, what mighty wind blew here today? Xiao Cherimoya strode right up to me. He patted my shoulder heavily. Along. He chuckled darkly, his grip tightening in a blatant display of dominance that reeked of cheap cologne and expensive cigars. Stop fooling around. Come back with me. I've successfully secured that piece of land in the east side of the city. From now on, all the operations over there will be handed over to you. The terms he offered were exceedingly tempting. Any other gangster would have found it impossible to decline. Yet, I flatly refused. Fourth Master, thanks. The classic I'm out of the game trope, but this time our mobster is swapping turf wars for standardized testing. Truly groundbreaking. But I have already washed my hands of the underworld. Xiao Cherimoya's expression darkened menacingly. Rambutan, do not be ungrateful for the favors I'm tossing your way. You think reading a few books for a couple of days can scrub you clean? Down to your very bones, you are just worthless mud. And this gang of misfits under you are all useless mud too. Mud can never be plastered onto a wall. His words were incredibly grating to the ears. All my brothers were instantly enraged, their veins popping on their necks as they glared daggers at the intruders, offended not just as gangsters, but as dedicated scholars. Every single one of them clenched their fists tight. I held them back with a gesture. I replied to Xiao Cherimoya, whether we are mud or not, does not require your definition. The college entrance exam will prove everything. Xiao Cherimoya scoffed. The exam? Relying on them? He pointed mockingly at the vicious scar on Pao Yuzu's face. Why do not you ask him? Does he even know what a parabola is? He then pointed aggressively at Humangstein's sprawling tattoos. Why do not you ask him if he knows who Shakespeare is? Rambutan, stop lying to yourself and others. You people were inherently never meant to be scholars. Your fate is to rot at the absolute bottom rungs of society. After saying that, he arrogantly pulled out a check from his pocket, flicking it between his fingers with a look of immense superiority, genuinely believing that money could buy away our resolve, and tossed it disdainfully at my face. 1 million. Take the cash, and disband this laughable exam crash course of yours. Otherwise, bear the consequences yourself. The check fluttered gently before landing on the dusty floor. I made no move to pick it up. I stared directly into Xiao Cherimoy's eyes, enunciating every single syllable clearly. Our destinies are dictated by ourselves alone. Xiao Cherimoy's eyes narrowed dangerously. Rambutan, are you entirely sure you want to pit yourself against me over this pathetic, ridiculous dream? This is not merely a dream. I said, this is our only way out. Xiao Cherimoy laughed. His laughter was dripping with profound disdain. Good, he sneered, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits as he realized his intimidation tactics had completely failed. Very good. I'm quite eager to see what kind of waves you piles of mud can actually manage to stir up. He turned on his heel. We're leaving. A legion of suit-clad men followed him out the door. The atmosphere in the main hall was profoundly oppressive. The brothers all looked at me, and also stared at that check lying on the floor. 1 million. To us, was a massive sum of money that could resolve all our underlying worries. Pao Yuzu walked over, picked up the check, and handed it to me. Brother Salak. I did not take it. I looked at him. Pao Yuzu, tell me, what is the standard equation of a parabola? Pao Yuzu was stunned. He opened his mouth but could not utter a single word, his face flushing bright red. I then looked toward Humangstein. Humangstein, what are Shakespeare's 4 great tragedies? Humangstein also choked up. Hamlet, Othello, and, he scratched his tattooed scalp, his fierce eyes darting around the room as if the answers were hidden in the cigarette burns on the wallpaper, sweat beading on his forehead. I scanned the room, everyone had lowered their heads. Xiao Cherimoy's words were like a sharp needle, piercing deeply into every single person's heart. Yeah, were we truly meant to be scholars? Could we genuinely change our destinies? After a prolonged silence, suddenly, the youngest brother, named Ma Kumquat, burst into tears. Brother Salak, am I really just stupid? I can't even figure out the most basic geometry sets. Am I just the kind of useless mud Xiao Cherimoy talked about? His sobbing seemed contagious. Very quickly, several brothers developed red-rimmed eyes. They were not afraid of brawling, nor were they afraid of shedding blood, but they were terrified of being looked down upon. The deep-seated insecurity of being societal outcasts gnawing at their souls far worse than any physical blade ever could. And even more terrified that they truly were, just as others claimed, good for nothing. I walked right up to Ma Kumquat and patted his shoulder. Ma Kumquat, you are not stupid. You simply never had the opportunity to learn before. I picked up the math test paper in his hand, pointing at one of the incorrect answers. Look here, your logic for this question is entirely correct. It's just that in the final calculation step, you mistook the plus sign for minus sign. This is not called being stupid. This is called being careless. Then, I stepped up to the podium, facing all of my brothers. I picked up a piece of chalk, gripping it firmly as I turned to the blackboard, feeling the weight of 300 fragile hopes resting entirely on my shoulders, and wrote 2 massive characters on the blackboard, dignity. I turned around. Do you guys know what dignity is? In the past, we thought whoever had the hardest fists had dignity. Whoever controlled the most turf had dignity. But we were wrong. That kind of dignity is an illusion, collapsing with a single push. Why did Xiao Cherimoy dare to stand right in front of our faces today and call us worthless mud? Because he has money and power, and education. With a flick of his finger, he could doom us to eternal damnation. And what about us? Besides our fists, we have nothing else. This is precisely why we lack dignity. I slammed my hand against the wooden desk, the sharp crack echoing through the silent room, ensuring every single man felt the stinging reality of my words. I pointed at the words on the blackboard. True dignity is not handed to you by others. It is earned through our own relentless effort. How do we earn it? By relying on this. I hoisted my copy of 5 years of college entrance exams, 3 years of mock tests knowledge. When you can solve the most difficult math equations, when you can compose the most beautiful essays, when you can speak fluent English, who will dare call you worthless mud ever again? When you hold a university acceptance letter, find a respectable job, and live and honorable, upright life. Who will dare to look down on you? If Xiao Cherimoya looks down on us, it does not matter. I let my gaze sweep across the room, making eye contact with the toughest brawlers who were now wiping tears from their scarred faces. If the whole world looks down on us, it does not matter either. But we cannot look down on ourselves. My voice echoed throughout the entire main hall. The brothers slowly raised their heads. The confusion and self-doubt in their eyes were gradually replaced by a radiant, unwavering determination. Pao Yuzu suddenly let out a deafening roar. He marched right up to me, snatched the check from my hand, and ripped it into tiny shreds. Screw that bastard Xiao Cherimoya. Today, I am going to carve the parabola equation right into my brain. Y squared equals 2px. Hu Mangosteen also roared powerfully, beating his massive, tattooed chest like a silverback gorilla claiming his territory, his voice vibrating the glass of the nearby windows. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. Not only will I memorize them, I'm going to read the original texts. 300 brothers were like dry fire that had just been ignited. They transformed all their grievances, rage, and unwillingness to yield into fuel for studying. Study. Everyone. Study like your life depends on it. Whoever fails to get into a university is a coward. Nothing says gangster quite like threatening your homies with academic failure. The oath-taking rally transformed into a study mobilization meeting. Watching them dive back into mountains of books and seas of exercises, I knew Xiao Cherimoya's humiliation had not broken us. Instead, it had made us vastly stronger. However, I also knew the situation would not end so easily. I stood by the window, watching the neon lights flicker outside, already anticipating the underhanded tactics that arrogant boss would deploy next. Xiao Cherimoya was not the type of person to let things go easily. Sure enough, trouble arrived the very next day. The health department, the fire department, and the commerce bureau took turns showing up for inspections. They claimed our venue possessed severe sanitation and fire safety hazards, ordering us to suspend operations and rectify the issues. I knew it was Xiao Cherimoya playing dirty tricks behind the scenes. He wanted to cut off our retreat. The brothers were furious. Brother Salak, let's fight them. Yeah, let's go smash up Xiao Cherimoya's joints. I shook my head. No. If we strike now, we'll fall right into his trap. He is desperately hoping we revert to our old ways. I crossed my arms, maintaining a stoic facade while my mind raced through tactical alternatives, refusing to let my students turn back into street thugs. Then what should we do? We can't actually shut down, can we? If this place closes, where are we supposed to study? I stared at the main doors, now plastered with official closure seals. After a moment of silence, I said, we'll relocate. Where? To a place they would never anticipate, and a place they would never dare to cause trouble in. Half an hour later, I led my 300 brothers, showing up at the entrance of the city library. Everyone was carrying a backpack and holding textbooks, looking just like a flock of ordinary high school students. The library administrator was an auntie in her 50s. She peered over her reading glasses, her jaw dropping as if she had just witnessed a biker gang invade a monastery. She jumped in fright upon seeing our massive crowd, especially when she noticed the tattoos on our bodies. You. What are you trying to do? I stepped forward, handed over my library card, and offered what I believed to be my most amiable smile. Auntie, we are here for self-study. The auntie looked at us with deep suspicion. I'd pointed at the banner on the library wall, an ocean of knowledge, a diligent ship. We are all good citizens who love learning. The auntie hesitated for a very long time. Ultimately, she still let us in. Remember, you must keep quiet. She whispered sternly, holding her index finger to her lips, still eyeing the muscular brutes as they tiptoed past her desk with exaggerated caution. Understood, Auntie. Over 300 of us marched into the library's largest reading room, found a corner, and settled down. We took out our books and commenced our studies. Not a single person uttered a word. The entire reading room was filled only with the sounds of flipping pages and writing. The other students and citizens who came to study all looked at us with expressions reserved for extraterrestrials. A burly man with a full-back tattoo of Guan Yu was intensely focused on memorizing English vocabulary. A big bro with full-sleeve tattoos was calculating complex physics formulas on scratch paper. A brother with a dragon coiled around his neck was silently reciting the poetry of Tsushima. He was mouthing the romantic verses with such tender devotion that it fiercely contradicted the menacing ink snaking up his throat. This visual contrast was simply too impactful. I noticed some people covertly pulling out their phones to snap pictures of us. I did not stop them. I actually wanted them to film us. I wanted to let everyone know that we were dead serious. Xiao Cherimoy swiftly received the news. In a fit of rage, he smashed a cup in his office. Those idiots actually ran to the library. How am I supposed to go cause trouble for them there? His subordinate asked. Fourth master, what should we do now? Xiao Cherimoy pondered for a moment, revealing a chilling sneer. He slowly leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers as a venomous, calculating glint flashed across his narrowed eyes. Since they love studying so much, then I'll add a little extra spice for them. Go find a few top-tier scholars to meet them at the library. Right in the very domain they excel at. Utterly crush them. An hour later, several young men wearing elite university uniforms marched into the reading room, making a beeline straight toward us. The male student leading the pack held the Math Olympiad competition paper in his hand, slamming it down onto my desk. The leading student pushed up his glasses. He stared at me, his eyes carrying unconcealed arrogance. He sneered, looking down his nose at my worn-out textbooks as if he were examining trash left on the sidewalk. Are you Salak? I raised my head. Can I help you? I heard you guys are running some sort of college entrance sprint here. He pointed at the paper on the desk. Ah yes, the classic nerd intimidation tactic of slapping down an Olympiad exam. Works every time in anime. This is a preliminary test from this year's National Math Olympiad. Got the guts to play a little? Before I could even speak, the brothers behind me refused to stand for it. Pao Yuzu shot up from his seat. Who the hell are you? Coming over here to act like some big-shot wolf. The student did not even glance at Pao Yuzu. His gaze remained locked entirely on me. My name is Wu Jabatakaba, from the mathematics department of C University. He puffed out his chest proudly, letting the prestige of his institution hang heavily in the quiet air of the library. It was fourth Master Zhao, who invited us to come and tutor you guys a bit. He heavily emphasized the word tutor when he spoke. I understood immediately. Xiao Cherimoy simply switched his battle tactics. We weren't afraid of physical brawls. So he intended to use the thing we cared about most, to humiliate us. He wanted to prove that when it came to academics, we were equally just garbage. I picked up the test paper and took a glance. The questions were exceedingly difficult. They were undeniably at the competition level. Given the current proficiency of my brothers, merely understanding the prompts would be a massive struggle. I mentally calculated the odds, knowing my gang was still struggling with basic calculus, let alone abstract algebraic structures. Seeing me remain silent for a long time, Wu Jabatakaba deepened the smirk on his lips. What? Do not have the guts? Where did all that bold talk go just now? I guess the so-called knowledge changes destiny is just a joke. Ha! The few students behind him joined in the mocking laughter. Their chuckles echoed piercingly inside the serene reading room. The other people studying nearby all turned their gazes toward our direction. Their eyes were brimming with curiosity and the desire to watch a good show. My brothers' faces flushed deep red one by one, their knuckles cracking as they clenched their fists. This was a humiliation far harder to endure than a physical beating. I set the test paper down, looking at Wu Jabatakaba. How do you want to play? It is very simple. The five of us. He leaned forward, planting both palms flat on my desk, his breath carrying the faint, bitter scent of cheap campus coffee. Against any 5 people you pick. We'll solve this exam paper for exactly 1 hour. Whoever scores highest wins. If you guys win, we leave immediately, and we will never bother you again. But if you lose... He paused, scanning the room. You will all roll out of here. Stop defiling this sacred sanctuary of the library. So, how about it? Dare to take the bet? Pao Yuzu panicked. Brother Salak, you can't agree. This is blatantly bullying people. Yeah, Brother Salak. How long have we even been studying? How is it possible? A hefty brother whispered anxiously, wiping cold sweat from his brow, fully aware that their recent cramming was no match for university prodigies. To beat these top students from a prestigious university? I ignored them. I stared at Wu Jabatakaba. The stakes aren't high enough. Wu Jabatakaba raised an eyebrow. Oh, then what else do you want to add? If we win, you, and those 4 behind you, must bow and apologize to my brothers in front of the entire library, admitting that you look down on us with your snobbish dog eyes. Wu Jabatakaba's complexion changed. He had not expected me to boldly make such a demand. A student behind him chimed in, Brother Ko, do not waste words with him. How could a bunch of illiterates possibly beat us? Wu Jabatakaba thought for a second, his hubris blinding him to the intense, unshakable confidence radiating from my calm demeanor, and nodded. Fine. I accept your terms. But if you lose, aside from getting the hell out of the library, you, Salak, must kneel down and shine our shoes. Deal. I stood up. We do not need 5 people on our side. Just me alone is enough. The entire venue erupted in an uproar. Everyone stared at me, with the kind of eyes reserved for a total lunatic. Wujabadakaba was also dumbfounded. Soon after, he burst into a fit of roaring laughter. Salak, you. Has reading books made you brain dead? One person challenging 5 of us from C University's math department. He clutched his stomach, laughing so hard that tears formed in the corners of his eyes, thoroughly entertained by my supposed delusion. Who do you think you are? Hua Yuo Jang. I did not say a word. I simply pulled up a chair and sat down, picking up a pen. Can we begin now? The timer is set for 1 hour. Seeing that I was not joking around, Wujabadakaba also stowed away his grin. All right. You asked for this. Do not come crying and begging for mercy later. The administrator auntie wanted to come over and intervene, but sensing this highly explosive, tense atmosphere, she did not dare step forward. She could only stand far away, watching with intense anxiety. She wrung her hands nervously, silently praying that this academic duel would not devolve into a full-blown library brawl. Plot twist: the librarian is actually a retired underground fighting champion ready to throw down. As the minutes and seconds ticked by, Wujabadakaba and his crew quickly hit their stride. Truly worthy of being top students from an elite university, their problem-solving speed was astonishingly fast. Pen tips flew across the paper, with almost zero pauses. Yet, I endlessly delayed putting pen to paper. I merely stared at the test sheet, motionless, as if I were spacing out. My brothers were all getting frantic. What is Brother Salak doing? Why has not he started writing yet? It is over. It is all over. We're going to get humiliated horribly this time. Wujabadakaba's side also noticed my situation. He shot me a highly contemptuous side glance, a smug, victorious smirk playing on his lips, convinced that he had already shattered the spirit of the underworld boss, revealing a trace of triumphant smugness in his eyes. I surely could not even comprehend the questions, hence why I had directly given up. Half an hour slipped away. Wujabadakaba and his team had already finished the majority of the exam, but my paper remained a vast, empty blank space. I had not even written my name. Pao Yuzu was so anxious he was practically on the verge of crying. He was itching to charge forward, snatch my pen, and write for me. Right at that very moment, I moved. I grabbed the pen. But instead of starting to answer the questions on the front, I flipped the test paper over to the back. On the blank reverse side, I began to write. Everyone was stunned, having no clue what I was intending to do. Wujabadakaba also furrowed his brows. He paused his frenzied calculations, staring at my unconventional approach with a mix of mild irritation and growing suspicion. He felt I was deliberately being needlessly mysterious. I ignored the gazes of everyone around me. I fully immersed myself in my own world. The speed of my pen grew faster and faster. Rows upon rows of numbers, formulas, and symbols flowed effortlessly from beneath my pen. They were no longer dry, tedious mathematical language. Rather, they resembled a massive army, conquering cities and seizing territories under my strict command. Within my mind, emerged the image of that summer from many years ago. I too sat just like this in front of a battered, worn-out desk, utilizing knowledge as my solitary weapon, battling against the cruel fate of poverty and injustice. That exact feeling, the raw, burning adrenaline of academic conquest racing through my veins, making the chaotic world fade away into pure logic and reason. I had found it once again. At the 50-minute mark, Wujabadakaba and his 4 companions put their pens down almost simultaneously. They let out long sighs of relief, relaxed expressions washing over their faces. Even though the questions were brutal, they had successfully completed them anyway. They exchanged glances, seeing profound confidence in each other's eyes. Wujabadakaba stood up, walked over to me, and stared down at me condescendingly. Salak, time is almost up. How many words did you manage to write? Do you want me to lend you mine to copy? His mocking remarks triggered a chorus of roaring laughter. The university elites chuckled into their hands, thoroughly relishing the sight of a supposedly terrifying gangster being brought to heel by advanced mathematics. I did not lift my head. I wrote down the very final digit, and then gently set the pen down. I'm finished, I stated. Wujabadakaba froze for a second. He leaned in to inspect my exam paper. The front side was entirely blank. He instantly sneered. Finished. Salak, are you treating us like a bunch of fools? You finished without writing a single character. I flipped the test paper over. I wrote it on the back. Wu Jabatakaba grabbed my exam paper. The moment he saw the contents on the reverse side, a smug smile on his face froze solid. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, rapidly darting across the ink-stained page as his brain struggled to process the sheer genius before him. The back of the test paper was densely packed with a comprehensive problem-solving process. However, it was not for a single question, but rather for all the questions. I utilized a methodology he had never witnessed before. I constructed a unified mathematical model, and then systematically translated every single problem on the exam into varied parameter queries, falling under this overarching model. Ultimately, employing just one core formula, I unlocked the answers to all the questions. This was no longer merely solving a test. This was a dimensional strike. Wu Jabatakaba and his fellow classmates all crowded around rapidly. They huddled over the single sheet of paper like desperate men finding a treasure map, their academic arrogance evaporating into thin air. Staring at my problem-solving progression, it was as if they were beholding something utterly inconceivable. Their expressions shifted from shock to bewilderment, and then to pure reverence. The 1-hour time limit expired. I stood up. Can we compare answers now? Wu Jabatakaba did not speak. His eyes, along with those of his classmates, remained glued firmly to my test paper, as if they were magnetically attracted to it. As they read, they engaged in hushed, intense discussions. This model is way too ingenious. How did he even come up with this? Plot twist, he learned it by calculating bullet trajectories during his turf wars. This essentially structured the entire exam entirely. Look here, this deduction step is practically a stroke of divine genius. A bespectacled student gasped, tracing the complex equation with a trembling finger, looking as though he had just met his personal deity. They had entirely forgotten about the competition, thoroughly captivated by my analytical reasoning. They resembled a group of devout believers witnessing a divine miracle. I grew slightly impatient. I knocked on the desk. Hey, the competition is over. It is time for final verdict on who won and who lost, right? Only then did Wu Jabatakaba snap out of his trance. When he raised his head to look at me, his gaze had transformed entirely. It was no longer filled with contempt and disdain, but rather a complex emotion, blending profound fear and idolization. He picked up his own exam paper and checked it against my answers. His face instantly turned deathly pale. His 4 classmates frantically fumbled through their own meticulously written pages, desperately searching for any flaw in my flawless logic, only to find none. Also took out their respective test sheets one by one. The result was identical. Out of the 5 of them, every single one had made varying degrees of mistakes. Yet, I was entirely correct. Furthermore, my problem-solving methodology was vastly more concise and efficient than their standardized answer key. If they were fighting with millet and rifles, then I was deploying an intercontinental ballistic missile. We weren't even on the same dimension. Inside the reading room, a pin-drop silence fell. Everyone was thoroughly shell-shocked by this outcome. My brothers were stunned for a long while at first, before erupting into an earth-shattering wave of cheers. The burly men leaped into the air, hugging each other and crying tears of joy as if they had just won the World Cup. Brother Salak is a beast. Brother Salak is mighty. In their wild excitement, they hoisted me up and tossed me into the air. The administrator auntie wanted to march over and stop their loud clamoring, but upon seeing their sheer ecstatic joy, she swallowed the reprimands that had reached her lips. A gratified smile also blossomed on her face. Wu Jabatakaba and his peers stood frozen in place, like 5 lifeless statues. Their deeply ingrained pride and self-assurance had been pulverized by me. The academic knowledge they were so terribly proud of appeared incredibly fragile and vulnerable before me. I stepped down from my brother's broad shoulders and walked right over to Wu Jabatakaba. Is it time to honor the bet now? I asked calmly, brushing a speck of dust off my sleeve, offering him no hostility but rather a firm demand for accountability. Wu Jabatakaba's lips quivered uncontrollably. He looked at me, and then glanced at the muscular men behind me who, despite their excitement, weren't actually mocking him at all. He took a remarkably deep breath, and bowed deeply toward me. I apologize. Then, he turned to face my brothers, bowing once again. I am sorry. We were the snobbish dogs looking down on people. His 4 classmates also followed his lead, bowing in apology. Their attitudes were genuinely sincere. I nodded. All right. You may leave now. Yet, Wu Jabatakaba did not depart. He stood his ground, shuffling his feet awkwardly as a rosy blush crept up his neck, evidently wrestling with a massive internal conflict. He hesitated for a brief moment, stepped up to me, and spoke in a tone bordering on begging. Teacher, you, that problem-solving approach you utilized just now, could Could you possibly teach it to us? I was dumbfounded. He was actually calling me teacher. Before I could even issue a response, a student standing behind him swiftly yanked a wallet out of his pocket, pulling out every single bill inside, and shoved it forcefully into my hands. Teacher Zhu, this is our tuition fee. Please, we beg you, accept us as your students. The other guys also hastily dug out their cash. The scene temporarily spiraled into sheer chaos. The former arrogant elites were now practically throwing money at a gang leader, desperate for a sliver of his mathematical enlightenment. I was caught between laughing and crying at their antics. All right, put all your money away. This methodology is not something that can be clarified in just a sentence or two. If you guys truly wish to learn, you can come audit our classes in the future. I won't charge any tuition. Upon hearing this, Ujabatakaba and his crew were instantly overjoyed. Thank you, Teacher Shu. Thank you, Teacher Shu. They offered me another flurry of blows, before finally leaving with great reluctance. Thus, a potential crisis was diffused just like that. Furthermore, it brought me an entirely unexpected harvest. This exact incident rapidly spread across the campus forums of C University. The post exploded with thousands of shares overnight, sparking wild conspiracy theories about a secret society of genius thugs operating in the city's underbelly. Shocking! A genius math department top scholar was brutally crushed on the spot by a mysterious tattooed man at the library. Who exactly is that man? What terrifying mathematical abilities had he mastered? Overnight, I became a living legend at C University. The next day, when we returned to the library, we discovered that the people seeking us out were no longer just Wujabatakaba and his 4 friends, but a massive, sweeping crowd of dozens of C University students. There were students from the mathematics department, the physics department, and even the computer science department. They had all heard of my miraculous deeds, and came out of profound admiration. They surrounded us tightly in a massive circle, eagerly asking me all sorts of academic questions over each other. The scene was even more exaggerated than a crazed fan meet and greet. My brothers were utterly dumbfounded. They had never imagined that one day, their brother Salak would become the ultimate idol of a group of gifted elites. The burly thugs just blinked in stunned silence, scratching their tattooed heads as they watched top-tier scholars fighting for a chance to ask me about multivariable calculus. And they also basked in the reflected glory. Those university students were incredibly polite to them as well, sweetly calling them big brother with every breath. They took the initiative to explain practice problems to them. Big brother. The auxiliary line for this geometry question should be drawn like this. Big brother. The root of this English vocabulary word means this. It makes it much easier to memorize this way. My brothers, for the very first time in their lives, felt what it was like to be genuinely respected. This respect was not because their fists were hard, but because their boss possessed profound knowledge. Their motivation to study surged even higher. The entire reading room formed a highly peculiar yet beautiful landscape. On one side sat a group of robust men heavily inked with dragons and tigers, their massive biceps bulging against their tight shirts as they delicately held pink highlighters, squinting at complex diagrams with the intensity of diffusing a bomb. And on the other side was a cluster of elite academic prodigies. 2 entirely different groups of people with clashing aesthetics were sitting together in unparalleled harmony, collaboratively exploring the profound mysteries of knowledge. This, perhaps, is the true power of education. It can transcend status, transcend social class, transcend boundaries, and make everyone who pursues it equal. The power of education speech is hitting hard, but honestly, seeing gangsters with face tattoos running study groups is the wholesome content we did not know we needed. Xiao Cheramoya's side also swiftly learned of this incident. The people he sent to humiliate me had actually turned into my loyal students. This made him feel like an utter clown. He was so infuriated he nearly smashed his entire office to pieces. Trash. A bunch of useless trash who can't even handle a few street thugs. He roared at the top of his lungs, veins bulging on his forehead as he hurled a crystal ashtray across the room, shattering a $1 million painting on the wall. His subordinates asked tremblingly, "Fourth Master, what do we do next?" Xiao Cheramoya paced back and forth across the room, his gaze dark and sinister. "If civil methods fail, we resort to martial ones. Aren't they desperately trying to take the college entrance exams? I will make sure they can't even step foot inside the examination hall." There was only one final month left until the exam. The study atmosphere had reached its peak intensity. My brothers were practically risking their lives to study. Everyone had visibly lost weight, yet their eyes were shining brighter than ever before. They were no longer that original gang of thugs, who only knew how to fight and kill. Deep within them, A profound transformation had taken root, replacing the cold, street-hardened apathy with an undeniable thirst for a better tomorrow. Something called hope had blossomed. That large group of students also became our regulars. Not only did they come themselves, but they also brought along their teachers and professors. The gray-haired senior professor from the physics department, after reviewing Humanistein's force analysis diagrams, excitedly patted his shoulder. "Young man, you possess remarkable talent. Your intuition for mechanics is even stronger than the doctoral students I mentor. Are you interested in applying for a master's degree in our physics department?" Humanistein's face flushed crimson from the praise. He repeatedly waved his hands. "Professor, please do not joke around with me. I'd be burning high incense in gratitude if I just managed to get into an undergraduate program." The massive thug rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly, his intimidating tiger tattoos awkwardly contrasting with his genuinely bashful, student-like demeanor. The professor, however, was dead serious. "I'm not joking. As long as your exam score crosses the required threshold, I will personally write a recommendation letter for you." Scenes like this occurred on a daily basis. My brothers were slowly gaining recognition from an increasing number of people. They also grew increasingly confident. I genuinely thought our days would continue this peacefully. Until exactly 1 week before the college entrance exam. We were at the library conducting our final full-scale mock test when suddenly, a squad of police officers stormed in. The person leading the charge was not Lin Fei Joa, but a middle-aged man I did not recognize. He wore a stern expression, holding an arrest warrant in his hand. "Chusalak," he barked out coldly, his sharp eyes scanning the room filled with studying gangsters before locking onto me like a hawk spotting its prey. "You are suspected of intentional assault. Come with us." I was frozen in place. Intentional assault. When did I? It was Xiao Cherimoya. He had framed me. Pao Yuzu and the others instantly swarmed around us. "On what grounds are you arresting us?" "Brother Salak is being framed." The officers immediately drew their firearms. "Anyone who dares to obstruct official duties will be arrested together." I held back my impulsive brothers. "Nobody move." I turned to the lead officer and stated, "I want to see my lawyer." I kept my voice deadly calm, though my mind was racing through 1,000 different scenarios of how Xiao Cherimoya orchestrated this blatant setup. That officer let out a cold sneer. "Once you're at the station, you can take your sweet time seeing Luan. Take him away." I was handcuffed. Right before leaving, I turned back to my brothers and said, "Do not panic. Trust me, and more importantly, trust yourselves. Even if I am not here, you must continue your revision. The college entrance exam is your own battle. You aren't taking it from me. Do you all understand?" The brothers fought back tears and nodded vigorously. I was taken away. Upon arriving at the police station, I finally realized that the situation was far more severe than I had anticipated. The interrogation room was cold and windowless, reeking of stale cigarette smoke and the oppressive weight of fabricated guilt. Xiao Cherimoya had hired a man to purposely break his own legs, and then adamantly bite down on the claim that I did it. He also procured several so-called eyewitnesses. All the evidence pointed directly at me. This was a dead end. The person in charge of interrogating me was that same middle-aged officer who led the arrest. His name was Captain Sun Kiwano. He slammed a thick stack of testimonies right in front of me. "Chusalak, both human testimonies and physical evidence are present. Do you still wish to quibble?" I stared back at him. "I did not do it." Captain Sun Kiwano sneered. "Everyone who enters this place says that. I advise you to just confess honestly." He leaned across the metal table, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me into a false admission, and strive for leniency. No matter how he interrogated me, I refused to open my mouth again. Seeing my lack of cooperation, Captain Sun Kiwano flared up in anger. "Fine. You got guts, Chusalak. Let's see how long you can keep that stubborn mouth shut." He threw me straight into the detention cell. Ah, the classic villain frames the hero right before the big tournament/exam trope. Xiao Cherimoya is playing straight from the 90s bad guy playbook. Time slipped away day by day. My heart also slowly sank to the bottom. What I worried about was not myself, but my brothers. Without me there, how would they fare? Would they give up? Could they withstand the immense pressure and walk into the examination hall? I sat on the rigid iron bed, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the ceiling, tortured by the thought of their hard work crumbling away. On the day of the college entrance exam, I sat alone in the freezing detention cell, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I envisioned my brothers, currently sitting inside the examination rooms, making one final, desperate push for their futures. I do not know how long had passed, but the door to the detention cell was suddenly thrust open. Lin Fei Zhou walked in. She had lost weight and looked haggard, yet her gaze was unusually resolute. She looked at me. Zhu Salak, I am here to take you out. I was stunned. What is going on? I quickly stood up, the metallic clinking of my handcuffs breaking the heavy silence as a flicker of unexpected hope ignited in my chest. Lin Fei Zhou replied, new evidence has surfaced for your case. She handed me a tablet computer. A video was currently playing on the screen. Inside the video, Xiao Cherimoya and his so-called victim were drinking at a private clubhouse. The victim's legs were perfectly fine, without a single scratch on them. In the footage, Xiao Cherimoya patted his shoulder, laughing uproariously. Ah, brother, you've worked hard this time. Once Zhu Salak is convicted and takes the fall, I will give you a massive red envelope. By then, the entire south side of the city will be our brother's territory. The evidence was irrefutable. The clarity of the video and the crystal-clear audio left zero room for misinterpretation, exposing the vile conspiracy in broad daylight. I looked up at Lin Fei Zhou. Where did you get this video? I was not the one who died. It was that group of brothers of yours. I misjudged them entirely. Lin Fei Zhou nodded. After you were arrested, they did not give up. They continued their revisions while simultaneously figuring out how to save you. They knew Xiao Cherimoya would inevitably slip up, so they dispatched people to keep an eye on him 24 hours a day. However, Xiao Cherimoya is extremely cunning, keeping his whereabouts highly secretive. They simply could not find an opening. Just as they were on the verge of despair, that group of C University students provided them with assistance. A genius from the computer science department wrote a minor program, utilizing some advanced tracking algorithms that bypass standard firewalls to penetrate the Mafia boss's digital security network. Hacked into Xiao Cherimoya's smartphone, pinpointed his exact GPS coordinates, and remotely activated his phone's camera, recording this precise video. I listened, utterly dumbfounded, using hacker techniques to obtain criminal evidence. This was far too unimaginably creative. Lin Fei Zhou continued speaking. After securing the video, they did not immediately report it to the local police because they did not trust Captain Sun Kiwano. Instead, they sent the video directly to the Inspectorate Division of the Municipal Police Bureau. The Bureau's leadership took it extremely seriously, immediately dispatching a covert task force to bypass local corruption and apprehend the true mastermind, and promptly established a special investigation team. Now, Captain Sun Kiwano has been suspended pending investigation. Xiao Cherimoya and his accomplices have also been taken into custody. Zhu Salak, you are a free man. Lin Fei Zhou unlocked my handcuffs. I stretched my numb wrists, my heart swelling with highly complex, mixed emotions. I never anticipated that the thing that ultimately saved me was not my fists, nor was it my underworld connections, but rather my brothers, utilizing the academic knowledge they had just acquired to wash away my wrongful charges. Knowledge truly had altered our destinies. I walked out, the passing sunlight piercing my eyes. I squinted against the bright rays, taking a deep breath of the fresh, unconfined air that tasted sweeter than ever before. I saw my 300 brothers, all standing at the entrance of the police station. They were all wearing those identical school uniforms, printed with "Knowledge changes destiny." They had just concluded their final exam subject, and rushed directly from the examination hall to this place. Upon seeing me, they did not cheer or shout. They merely watched me in serene silence, and then bowed to me in perfect, synchronized unison. Brother Salak, we finished the exams, Pao Yuzu said. His voice carried a noticeable trace of choked-back sobs. I walked over, patting their shoulders one by one. How did you all do? Rest assured, Brother Salak. I solved all the major physics questions. The younger brother exclaimed, puffing out his chest proudly as he wiped away a stray tear of immense relief. Pao Yuzu also puffed out his chest. I even managed to crack the final bonus question on the math test. A gang of tattooed mobsters flexing their AP physics scores instead of their street cred. This is the anime character development arc we all deserve. Brother Salak, my English essay was written entirely about your story. I looked at them, at each and every face overflowing with confidence and pure joy. I knew that regardless of what the final results might be, we had already emerged victorious. On the day the college entrance exam scores were released, all of us gathered in the nightclub's main hall. The atmosphere was vastly more tense than the day we confronted Mad Dog Wang Kiwano. Everyone was clutching their admission tickets tightly in their hands, their palms drenched in sweat. I stood at the podium and looked at them. Do not be nervous. I forced a reassuring smile, even though my own heart was hammering wildly against my ribs like a trapped bird. If you score well, we'll pop champagne to celebrate. If you do not score well, we'll try again next year. Remember, the college entrance exam is merely a starting point in life, not the end point. I said this out loud, but internally, I was more anxious than anyone else. This did not just represent their academic results, it represented mine as well. It was the ultimate test of all my blood, sweat, and tears over the past 6 months. At exactly 3 p.m. in the afternoon, the score inquiry portal officially opened. Mangstein was the first to walk up to the podium. He took a deep breath and typed his admission ticket number into the computer. He clicked search. His massive, trembling finger hovered over the mouse button for what felt like an eternity before finally pressing down with a decisive click. The webpage refreshed. Everyone held their breath collectively. The moment the score was displayed on the screen, the entire hall first fell into a deathly silence, and then erupted into a tsunami-like roar of ecstatic cheers. 625 points. Mangstein, a former street thug who once could not even write his own name properly, gangster, scored an astonishing 625 points. The score was high enough to secure admission into any prestigious university in the country. Mangstein stared at the numbers on the monitor in a daze for a long while. And then, this brawny man who stood over 1.9 meters tall hugged the monitor and wailed uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his scarred face, washing away years of societal rejection and self-doubt in one magnificent outpouring of raw emotion. Next up was Pao Yuzu, with 500 points. Ma Kumquat, 500 points. One brother after another walked up to the stage, entered their admission ticket numbers, and subsequently reaped their own miraculous surprises. Out of 300 men, the lowest score achieved was a solid 480 points, well surpassing this year's undergraduate cutoff line. Every single one of us had successfully gotten into college. We had forged a miracle that even we ourselves hardly dared to believe. The entire nightclub metamorphosed into an ocean of sheer jubilation. We popped hundreds of bottles of champagne, spraying them at each other. Everyone was dripping wet from head to toe. Yet, on every person's face, hung the most radiant smile they had ever worn in their lives. The golden champagne caught the club's disco lights, creating a sparkling shower of victory that baptized these former criminals into scholars. I did not join in their wild revelry. I walked into my office alone, closed the door, and retrieved that yellowed college entrance exam transcript from my drawer. My 718 points. I stared at it for a profoundly long time. Then, I placed it, side by side with the score reports my brothers had just printed out. Placed together, I picked up a lighter and ignited that piece of paper belonging to the distant past. Amidst the flickering flames, I seemed to catch a glimpse of that helpless teenager from many years ago. He said to me, "Thank you. Thank you for never giving up," he whispered softly, his spectral voice blending with the crackle of the burning paper as the heavy burden of regret finally lifted off my soul. "And thank you for fulfilling my dream on my behalf." I smiled, but tears unknowingly streamed down my cheeks. The celebratory banquet lasted deep into the night. Everyone drank far too much, sleeping haphazardly scattered across the main hall. A contented smile rested on everyone's face as they dreamt sweet, beautiful dreams. I was alone, sweeping up the chaotic mess on the floor. Right at that moment, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered it. "Hello." A familiar voice traveled from the other end of the line. It was Linfei Joa. "Chu Salak, congratulations to all of you." Her voice carried a rare warmth, entirely devoid of her usual stern, authoritative police persona, feeling more like a call from an old friend. She sounded exceedingly delighted as well. "Officer, how did you know about our results? Your story has already made the headline news. 300 triad members washed their hands of the underworld, collectively admitted to universities, staging a real-life version of knowledge-changing destiny. You guys are massive celebrities across the entire city now." I smiled bitterly. This certainly is not what I wanted. Getting famous for studying so hard that it literally cures your gang affiliation. If this does not become a Netflix original, I'm writing. "Then what do you want?" Linfei Joa asked. I fell silent. What did I want? I just wanted all my brothers to secure a bright, promising future. I wanted them to be able to live with dignity and honor under the bright sunlight. Now, this goal had been halfway achieved. I gazed across the room at my sleeping comrades, knowing that the hardest part of their journey leaving the streets behind forever was already conquered. I haven't fully decided yet, but the first step is to help them fill out their university application preferences. Then, securing funding for their academic expenses. And after that, escorting them to report to their respective universities. Once they are all safely settled in, I will start considering my own affairs. Lin Feijiao also fell silent on the other end of the line. After a brief pause, she said, Ju Salak, have you ever considered attending university yourself? With your capabilities, you are more than qualified to. I cut her off. I'm old now. Opportunity should be left for the younger generation. Lin Feijiao wanted to say something more, but I hung up the phone. I did not wish to discuss this topic any further. I tossed the phone onto the desk and ran a weary hand over my face, trying to suppress the lingering sting of a dream deferred for too long. Some regrets are destined to remain irremediable. The only thing I could do was ensure my brothers would never follow in my disastrous footsteps. In the ensuing days, I was incredibly busy, my feet barely touching the ground. I helped them analyze majors across various universities, researched the employment prospects of different cities, and meticulously tailored the most optimal application strategies for every single individual. Hu Mangustin applied for civil engineering at Tongji University. He stated he wanted to become an engineer in the future, to build the sturdiest bridges in the world. Pao Yuzu applied to the China University of Political Science and Law. He proudly declared that he would become a lawyer, adjusting his imaginary tie and puffing his chest, declaring that no one would ever be falsely framed under his watch. Dedicating himself to providing legal aid for people like us, Ma Kumquat applied to Beijing Foreign Studies University. He said he wanted to travel and explore the outside world. Everyone had successfully found their own bearing. A month later, acceptance letters flew in like swirling snowflakes. They practically encompassed all the top-tier academic institutions in the nation. The main hall of our nightclub was plastered full of these vibrant red acceptance letters, appearing far more luxurious than the lavish renovations of any premium KTV. We hosted a magnificent, grand celebratory college-bound banquet. All those students and professors from C University attended. Lin Feijiao also came. She was not wearing her police uniform, but instead wore an elegant white dress. The soft fabric flowed gracefully around her ankles, completely stripping away the formidable aura she usually carried during raids. She looked less like a police officer and more like a gentle teacher. During the banquet, she represented the municipal bureau to present us with a silk pennant. It read, "A prodigal son's return is priceless. Knowledge supports a brand new life." Everyone was phenomenally happy that day. Only my heart felt slightly hollow and empty, because I knew that after the feast came the inevitable partings. The September enrollment season arrived. I drove a large tour bus, delivering my brothers, one by one to their respective universities. With every new city we reached, and every person I saw off, a piece of my heart felt hollowed out. They held tightly onto my hands, deeply reluctant to part. Brother Salak, one of the toughest guys, sobbed, wiping his nose on his crisp new college sweater, refusing to let go of my grip. "You must visit us frequently. Brother Salak, you have to take good care of yourself. Brother Salak, once we graduate, we'll come back and work for you." I laughed and affectionately patted their heads. "Get lost. All of you, study hard. Do not ever mention the word work for me in the underworld again. Your lives have already turned to a brand new chapter. You must keep looking forward." Our final stop was Beijing. I dropped Ma Kumquat off at Beijing Foreign Studies University. After helping him settle in, I stood all alone at the gates of Tsinghua University, staring up at that majestic plaque reading Tsinghua Garden. I stood there in silence for a very long time. The golden autumn sunlight filtered through the ancient trees, casting a melancholic glow over the campus I had once sacrificed everything to enter. This place was once my ultimate dream all those years ago. Merely one step away, yet it became a lifelong regret. A voice suddenly rang out from behind me. "Aren't you going to go inside and take a look?" I turned around. It was Lin Feijiao. She had also come to Beijing. "Why are you here?" I asked in profound surprise. "I was transferred to work in Beijing. From now on, I will be stationed at the Haidian branch. It is very close to here." I was left speechless, not knowing what to say. Lin Feijiao walked up beside me, silently gazing at the university gates alongside me. "Ju Salak," she murmured softly, the gentle breeze rustling her hair as she turned her piercing, empathetic gaze toward my weathered face. "Are you truly not planning to live for yourself, just this once?" She brought up that topic once again. I shook my head. "My mission is already complete. I'm deeply satisfied right now." Lin Feijiao stared at me. "But I'm not satisfied. I believe you deserve so much more. You belong inside these gates, not standing on the outside." She pulled an envelope out of her bag and handed it to me. "Calling it right now is not a restraining order. It is a Hogwarts letter. I mean, A single acceptance letter. Peak cinematic payoff. What is this? Your admission letter. I was entirely stunned. I took the envelope and opened it with violently trembling hands. Inside lay an official admission letter from Tsinghua University. The crimson stamp and the elegant calligraphy seemed to blur before my eyes as a tidal wave of disbelief crashed over me. The Department of Computer Science and Technology, my own name, Ju Salak, was printed boldly upon it. I was thoroughly bewildered. What exactly is going on here? Lin Fei Zhou smiled brightly. Did you forget your own exam score? You were the provincial valedictorian back then. Even though the validity period for the score has expired, it can serve as a basis for a special talent application. I merely assisted you by submitting an exceptional circumstance petition to the Ministry of Education, explaining that you missed enrollment back then due to sudden family tragedies and being wrongfully framed. After investigating your situation, the officials at the Ministry of Education, especially upon learning of your miraculous deed, she paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears of immense pride as she recounted the sheer magnitude of what I had accomplished, of leading 300 brothers to pass the college entrance exam, were profoundly moved. They decided to grant you an opportunity for re-enrollment, handling your case as a special exception. Holding that single admission letter in my hand, I felt as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. I simply could not believe this was real. I ruthlessly pinched myself. It hurt terribly. This was not a dream. I, a former underworld kingpin, an ex-convict who had served time in prison, had actually received an admission letter from the prestigious Tsinghua University. I looked at Lin Fei Zhou, my eye sockets growing moist. Why did you help me? My voice cracked completely, the tough exterior I had worn for over a decade finally shattering into a million pieces. Lin Fei Zhou looked back at me, her gaze overwhelmingly tender. Because I firmly believe that a man capable of pulling 300 pieces of worthless mud up onto the wall should not be left to rot in the mud pit himself. Ju Salak, go on. Go fulfill your uncompleted dream. Your brothers are all waiting for you at the finish line. As their big brother, you can't afford to fall behind. I could no longer control my surging emotions. I pulled her into a tight embrace and sobbed openly like a child. All the grievances suffered over these years, all the bitter unwillingness, and all the regrets vanished into thin air in this precise moment. The following day, clutching my admission letter, I strode proudly into Tsinghua Garden. The grand gates seemed to embrace me as I finally crossed the threshold into the future I had almost lost forever. I saw my brothers Humangistine, Pao Yuzu, Ma Kumquat all standing at the entrance waiting for me. Having somehow caught wind of the news, they had rushed over from all across the country. Upon catching sight of me, they beamed with a joy that vastly eclipsed my own. They swarmed around me, forming a tight circle of brotherhood, and hurled me high into the air time and time again. The crisp autumn wind rushed past my ears as I was tossed toward the sky, looking down at the sea of tear-streaked, grinning faces of the men who had fought their way out of the gutter alongside me. Brother Salak, you are a legend. Brother Salak, we are officially university schoolmates now. I boldly rate this a 8/10 on the quantum physics scale. The reason? Because the plot made me laugh my dignity right off. I was mentally preparing to watch gangsters chase each other with machetes, but instead, these tattooed thugs whipped out 5 years of exams, 3 years of mock tests to solve. The peak of absurdity is using Newton's second law and Archimedes' lever principle to win a street fight. With this kind of academic combat ideology, Newton and Archimedes would probably pop the lids of their coffins to give a standing ovation. The first deeply nonsensical lesson to learn is, never underestimate fierce, tattooed guys on the street, because it's highly likely their full-back tattoo is actually the periodic table of elements and 3,500 essential English words. The second lesson, the best way to settle underworld grudges is not by clashing swords, but by challenging each other to solve a national math Olympiad exam. Whoever is dumber automatically forfeits the turf, keeping it civilized.